Very proud to welcome Dr. Samuel Moyn to Elon University. Samuel Moyn is James Bryce Professor of European Legal History at Columbia University in New York. He holds a PhD, I guess, in history from Berkeley, and a law degree from Harvard University. His research interests are in modern European intellectual history with special interest in France and Germany, political and legal thought, historical and critical theory, Jewish studies, and the history of human rights. I'll just pick up a few of the awards that he received, among them the Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship, the Student Council Teaching Awards at Columbia School of General Studies, the Mark Van Doren Teaching Award at Columbia College, and the Koret Foundation Jewish Studies Publication Prize. He has published 4 books by now, edited or co-edited 4 and edited 1, so 5 co-editing and 4 publications. His first book was A Holocaust Controversy, The Treblinka Affair in Post-War France. It is the book that got my attention. Next, he published The Origin of the Other, Emmanuel Levinas, Between Revelations and Ethics, The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, and his latest book, Human Rights and the Use of History. Why don't you help me welcome Dr. Samuel Moyn to Elon University.
Well, thank you especially to Professor Lubling, but mainly to all of you for coming. I'm very grateful. What I'd like to raise with you tonight is the problem of how we connect the idea of human rights to the Holocaust of European Jewry. Now, if you know anything about either of those items, you might think the problem is strange. Most people think that human rights were imagined to respond to the Holocaust once it became known in the 1940s. There was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the UN General Assembly passed in 1948. And that's just a few years after the Holocaust ended. How could human rights not have been a response to those terrible crimes? If you Google human rights and the Holocaust together, looking for pages on which they both appear, you will get 12 million hits as of yesterday. Here's a Harvard professor, almost the Prime Minister of Canada, and human rights expert Michael Ignatieff. The Holocaust laid bare what the world looked like when pure tyranny was given free rein to exploit natural human cruelty. Without the Holocaust, there would have been no Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, this link I want to investigate also matters, I think, politically. So a few months ago, we nearly went to war in Syria. And President Obama appeared on television to explain why we need to do it. And he said that gas was used to kill Jews during World War II in the Holocaust. And now Bashar al-Assad was using gas. He'd crossed a line by using that terrible weapon. The Security Council at the United Nations was deadlocked, but maybe human rights, the president told us, demand that we act. Now, I don't know if we should act. Maybe you know. The bloodshed is still going on, even though Syria is disarmed chemically. But I want to argue that all of these ideas about how human rights and the Holocaust are connected are not really correct. I want to show that it wasn't in the 1940s when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written that human rights were connected in our minds to the Holocaust in particular and atrocity in general. Instead, it was much later and under the force of new pressures. So what I want to spend most of my time with you doing is giving you like a series of stages in the history of the idea of human rights and what people meant when they said it. There are going to be three. And the first stage I'm going to call the welfarist stage. When we look back at the idea of human rights, which is basically new in the English language in the 1940s, especially kind of in high public places, it occurs before the Holocaust begins. It's used by Franklin Roosevelt, the president then, to explain what the point of a war then would be at a time when Americans didn't want to enter one. He first uses it in his State of the Union address in 1941. And he says that human rights are about the world, but they're really about the kind of world we want to live in. And it was going, he said, to be a welfarist world. The problem is he saw it. The reason he wanted American citizens to want to enter the war with him was that 19th century citizenship had failed. In the 19th century, the state was very small. It had police powers, but its purpose was not to provide citizens welfare, to make sure that they had housing, a job, health care, even vacations. And FDR said, we've learned what happens when those promises aren't kept. Depression. And of course, it's the depression that he thought, everyone thought, had led to Adolf Hitler's rise in the first place. And so when human rights began to be talked about during World War II itself, it had nothing to do with atrocity or the fate of the Jews. Actually, FDR had little interest in the fate of the Jews. He did know more about it than most Americans, but it didn't motivate him to oppose Hitler, let alone to intervene in the war. When he and other politicians on the winning side of World War II wanted to explain the war to their citizens, they sometimes used the idea of human rights. Actually, not very much. But when they did, they meant this welfare idea. In the midst of the war, the British government commissioned a report about what the state should do to help its citizens after. It's called the Beveridge Plan. And it's thanks to that plan that the National Health Service was set up right after the war. Winston Churchill, who was the prime minister, didn't want to do it, but he was thrown out of office at the end of World War II in the favor of a socialist government to give the nation a new kind of welfare citizenship, including health care. FDR, a few years later in 1944, gave another State of the Union address, and it was the second Bill of Rights address. He said, we had that old Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution. Now we need a new one. It will be for economic citizenship, at home, health care, jobs, vacations. Obamacare has come late relative to the British National Health Service, which they got right after World War II. But that's part of this welfarist plan. If you like, everyone was a welfarist at the end of World War II, even communists. Communists had also had to explain in the Soviet Union why so many millions of young men had died. And it wasn't certainly there about the horror of the Holocaust. It was about what communism would bring to ordinary people. And as communism grew after World War II, it was in this welfarist mode. What the West and the East differed about was not whether to have a welfare state, it was what kind, and whether you would need a communist revolution to get it done. Now, the crucial fact about this idea, sometimes human rights was used to sum it up, was that it was about the nation state. It was about citizenship here in our state. The Universal Declaration of 1948 comes from the United Nations, but it says the rights that it names, which include all of the economic and social rights I mentioned, it says are a common standard of achievement for all peoples and nations. No one almost in the 40s thinks of the point of human rights to make international law to help other people abroad. Rather, human rights are about our citizenship at home, making it a 20th century citizenship with new economic and social entitlements. That's human rights in the 40s. Now think about the Holocaust. Well, as I've said, most people say the Holocaust motivated the enunciation of human rights, but actually almost no one in the 1940s knew about the Holocaust, so it can't be true. The UDHR then was really a response to the Depression of 1929 and the political evil that came from it, but not in response to atrocity and genocide, which people didn't know or care about yet. The Nuremberg trials, which some of you I talked to earlier in the night had even visited the Peace Palace where they took place, barely touched on what had happened to the Jews during World War II. In fact, we can't find many people who don't use the phrase human rights in the 40s outside this welfare paradigm. And of course, there are many other ways to talk about the welfare state. There were changes in international order. The UN is founded. It wasn't the first international organization, it was the second. And it tried to do new things, but they mainly had to do with the regulation of violence. We've heard a lot of talk in the past 10 years about the Geneva Conventions. There was a genocide convention. But in these new documents, which were about international law and the control of violence when war breaks out, the idea of human rights isn't mentioned. In all the many months of the Nuremberg trials, not only the Jews weren't mentioned, the phrase human rights was never used. If you take those 4 items that I've discussed so far in the 1940s, I think you can tell why. The Universal Declaration was about a different problem. It was about our citizenship, the citizenship within the state, and how to make it better through welfare. Those other things I've mentioned, the Nuremberg trials, the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Conventions, were about global order and international order, not our citizenship. But when they became about war, they dropped any mention of human rights. So it seems as if people at the time used that phrase that we use all the time to talk about the world only for themselves at home, rather than for the world. Now, it's true, if you've read it, that the Universal Declaration is also a response to World War II. It was a response, though, in a sense, in its premise, that only if we provide economic citizenship to everyone, healthcare, jobs, vacations, that they wouldn't elect a Hitler and war would not break out. People at that time didn't care about the Holocaust, except for those few who had been touched closely by it. Remember that many non-Jews had experienced World War II, including in places like concentration camps. And after all, they were much more likely to survive Nazi horror and come home to tell their stories. Jews, especially in Poland, were typically shot on sight when they were found and buried or burned, or they didn't even get to spend the night in concentration camps. They were sent to death camps where they were killed immediately. All the people who came home from Nazi horror hadn't experienced either the shooting or the gassing. They'd survived, and they told very different stories, especially if they weren't Jewish. And so there was no consciousness of what we think had gone wrong in World War II. Instead, people thought the problem was the war itself, Adolf Hitler as an aggressive actor, having brought the world into war. The fate of the Jews was a detail to the extent it was known about at all. If you look at the Universal Declaration, it refers to disregard and contempt for human rights that have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. I think this meant that every nation had its horrors. The Nazis had done many terrible things to most people in Europe. If you took a poll in the 1940s about what the worst outrages at that time were, people would not mention Belzec or Treblinka, the death camps where the Jews had been put to death. They would have said Leningrad, where there was a terrible siege and people dying of hunger, or Lidice, which was razed to the ground, not because any Jews were involved, but because Czech nationalists assassinated a Nazi officer. And so when you look in the United Nations at the records of the General Assembly, when they debate the Universal Declaration, no one mentions the Jews. And again, this should not be surprising. When people thought about rights in these years of the 1940s, I think they thought of them in a different way than most of us think about them. Let me read you 3 texts from this era that are not the Universal Declaration. The first one begins like this: all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, you've heard that text. That's the Declaration of Independence. Actually, this snippet comes from far down in our document, but this text in 1945 starts with that American line, and then it continues this way. Now this means that all of the peoples on the earth are equal from birth. All the peoples have a right to live, to be happy and free. Here's a second text. Now this one's written mostly by socialists who believe in welfarism. They talk about rights, but only what they call the right of peoples to be masters of their own fate, just like all other nations, to have their own sovereign state. Here's a third text. It starts with "we the people," and we know where that comes from our Constitution. But it's actually a socialist document. It puts social welfare first, even before political and civil rights. Now, what are these 3 documents? The first is the Declaration of Independence of Vietnam in 1945, written by Communist Ho Chi Minh. The second was the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel. And the third was the Indian Constitution. Of those documents, there's one that mentions the Holocaust. And of course, it's not the Universal Declaration. It's not the Declaration of Independence. of Vietnam or the Indian Constitution is the Israeli Declaration of Independence. But what they think the Holocaust has allowed them to do or pressed them to do is found a sovereign nation state, and it will be socialist, since that's who's running Israel at the time. It seems as if everyone wants sovereignty and national welfare within sovereignty in the 1940s. Unlike others, Jews at the time, some of them knew about and cared about what had happened to their brethren, their co-religionists in Eastern Europe. But very few Jews called for human rights in the sense of international law, intervention abroad, of the kind we debate today when it comes to Syria. Actually, most Jews, some of whom survived in Eastern Europe, many of whom were socialists around the world, were very sympathetic to something called anti-fascism, which said the point of something that happens to a particular people is to build something for the world. But outside those circles, most Jews are nationalists. Most Jews who survive in the states of Western Europe want to rejoin their nations as Frenchmen or even Germans. And of course, when they think about the world, the Jews of the world are converting to often new Zionist commitments to back up that project in the Middle East of responding to the Holocaust with a new nation state, rights for peoples, and for the individuals in those peoples only through the state. So when we think about the 40s, we don't have popular Holocaust consciousness. We do have human rights, but it seems to mean something very different. It means national welfare. Now look at this chart I've handed out, because I do want to take something from the connection of human rights and the Holocaust. It's that it didn't happen in the 40s. This is the Google Ngram tool. It allows us, thanks to Google's wizardry, to find out when people used words and phrases and how often, and to compare words. You can do this at home with any words you like, even your own name. If you become famous enough, you'll see a blip. This shows, of course, this is known, that no one used the Holocaust with a capital H to refer to the genocide of the European Jewry until the 60s, and it only became popular in the 70s and 80s. Human rights, you see, did have use, but it enjoys only a modest uptick in the 1940s. And then something happens much later. It's as if these two concepts get joined at the hip and both enjoy lots of popularity. It's just not in the 1940s. And so that's the puzzle I want to keep exploring with you. So now I'm turning to my second stage, which I want to cover just briefly. It's the anti-colonialist stage of human rights. One kind of scary thing we find when we look at the 1940s is that most of the imperial powers in the world planned to keep their empires, and America decided to help them. Decolonization only happened later. That was the biggest event in world history, probably, and it seems as if human rights is imagined before anyone commits to decolonization. In the 1940s, the world had gotten very excited about some Allied rhetoric coming out of FDR and Winston Churchill, because they thought briefly that the Allies were not just promising national welfare for their own citizens, but that they were promising emancipation of all the peoples and nations in the world. But they were wrong. Churchill didn't plan to decolonize his empire. He planned to decolonize Hitler's empire, and that happened after World War II. But the decolonization of the world, and especially a place like Africa, only came about when push came to shove. In the middle phase of human rights history, there's no human rights movement. Amnesty International doesn't exist, Human Rights Watch doesn't exist. The only place where people continue to talk about human rights is the United Nations. And there, because of decolonization, all of the new states begin to dominate. Remember that in 1948, when the Universal Declaration was passed, there were only about 50 states. Now there are 200. And the huge number of new states meant new power for the decolonized world, and they did something to human rights. They said human rights should mean decolonization, freedom for peoples. And so even though this idea they said was very important, national self-determination hadn't been mentioned at all in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the new states make it the very first right in the human rights legal treaties we now have called covenants. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because human rights are still closely associated with the nation and the state. But now they're associated with the project of decolonizing the world, ending empire. If you like, the decolonization forces are thinking about the American example in 1776, just as Ho Chi Minh was in 1945. When we announced rights in 1776 in this country, it wasn't for the sake of suffering abroad. We didn't light a candle for the Syrian children. We didn't cut a check to Human Rights Watch. The Americans then, becoming Americans, picked up guns and fought an empire. And they used violence in the name of rights to get a state. Well, that's what decolonization was about too. Often they were able to get out of the British and the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese Empire through pressure, but not always. The Indians who wrote that Indian Constitution I mentioned had sometimes used violence, but mainly gotten the British to let them out. But in other places like Algeria and Kenya and Central Africa, lots of blood was shed. And it was in the name of human rights, just like in America in 1776. Here's the strange thing. At the United Nations, all the references to human rights in this middle phase are about strengthening sovereignty, the nation's strong borders. And we can see why that is. The nations of Africa had just spent 100 years under the thumb of European empires. The last thing they want is the great powers coming back. And so they say the first and most important human right is self-determination, and that means we get our nation state. And of course, they wanted high borders, strong borders, to keep the great powers at bay. Amazingly, we talk about human rights now. Barack Obama invoked gas of the Holocaust, invoked human rights as our highest values in the name of intervening someplace. But in this middle stage of human rights history, the point was to keep intervention from happening, winning a state for people in the first place who'd been under empire. It's almost like the opposite of what we mean by human rights. If you like, there's a connection with the 40s. Because as I said, in the 1940s, when people used human rights, they meant their own citizenship. They meant updating it to include 20th century goods like housing and healthcare. And now the decolonized world wanted the same thing. They wanted national welfare too. And so what anti-colonialism was about was not just taking sovereignty global, which the great powers had refused after World War II, but also taking national welfare global. The goal was to have a world of welfare states. And human rights still mean setting up citizenship for ourselves in a sovereign state. Now you get the third stage. It's, let's call it the humanitarian stage of human rights. It's very different. It seems to coincide with this chart. It comes about maybe a tiny bit in the 1960s, but mainly in the 1970s and 80s, but especially strongly after 1989. Now human rights suddenly means what we usually mean by it. It means atrocity prevention abroad, not welfare promotion at home. For at least the people like us, relatively wealthy in the world, it means caring about suffering far away and possibly doing something about it. Now, doing something about it will mean we have to turn our backs on the second stage of human rights, what I call the anti-colonial stage. After all, the point of that stage was to set up sovereignty with high borders. If you're a humanitarian, you want to blunt sovereignty. You want to find the conditions in which sovereignty doesn't matter because people do. And it might be up to a foreign actor like the American government to swoop in. That's what human rights seems to mean to us now. But it didn't mean that in the 40s. It didn't mean that in the 50s and 60s as sovereignty went global. Now, why did this shift happen? Why did this shift happen? I think that's, if you agree with my chronology, we have to ask, when did we become us? It wasn't in the 40s. It wasn't until several decades later. Well, here's one scary thought before we turn to some better thoughts. This is the same moment in the 70s when the idea of national welfare begins to enter crisis. In our country, remember Lyndon Johnson had pursued national welfare, the Great Society. Even Richard Nixon, in his views about things like the minimum wage, was far to the left of the contemporary Democratic Party in his views of what the state should do to help ordinary people. But we no longer have that program. Maybe Obamacare as a blast from the past, nothing of a similar ambition. We worry about the state getting too big, costing too much, not doing well at providing welfare, making people lazy by providing welfare, interfering with free enterprise. The 40s had been against free enterprise like the 19th century had had, because it led to ruin and the Great Depression. We've had another crisis and depression, but we haven't responded the same way as people in the 40s did. We still doubt the capacities of the state to bring us national welfare. That's what our debates are about. Well, there might be some good reasons that human rights in the humanitarian sense arose, and I think it's here that the Holocaust matters. But really, Holocaust memory, people suddenly learning what they hadn't known about or cared about in the 1940s, that the Jews had suffered atrocity, in fact, destruction, in the 1940s. Historians have worked on this problem. The chart illustrates that not just the Holocaust as a word came about, but our knowledge of it came out of nowhere in the 60s and 70s and became central to our moral consciousness. And that was true everywhere. America, Western Europe, Israel, at roughly the same time. As I said, it was non-Jews who dominated the memory of the war right afterwards. But now there was a new generation of people who succeeded in convincing the world that what really mattered about World War II was the death of the Jews in it, something that almost no one had thought in the 1940s. If you go into the street today, you might ask someone, what was World War II fought about? Or what was worst about it? And probably in both cases, they'd say immediately the Holocaust. No one would ever have said that in the 40s, first of all, because they knew the war wasn't fought over the Holocaust. Second, because they didn't know about the Holocaust or care about it. Now we do. Why did this happen? Well, we can point to some superficial facts. There were books that were read, that were written and sensitized us to what happened. But this isn't exactly a good answer. Primo Levi, the most famous, perhaps, Holocaust memoirist, had published Survival in Auschwitz, his famous book, in the 40s, but no one had read it or cared. Very few. The publisher pulped it. And then it became something you read at this college, from what I heard earlier today. Elie Wiesel's Night was published much later in the late 50s. Only about a decade later became a global classic. And some good films, bad films, good books, bad books were written about the Holocaust. And now we begin to think that what's at stake in ethics is not building our own citizenship. It seems to be about what can happen in politics that's evil abroad. And my sense is that this event, the rise of Holocaust memory, helped transform what the concept of human rights meant as the two became joined at the hip. If we think about it, Adolf Hitler didn't make sovereignty a bad word. It's surprising, but it's true. In fact, it was after Adolf Hitler that the Allies set up the United Nations, which is based on sovereignty. And as I said, the sovereignty of the nation state went global thanks to decolonization. Now we're very suspicious of sovereignty. We definitely don't think it should be absolute because states can commit evil acts on their own citizens. People didn't seem to respond that way to Hitler's sovereignty, but now we do to Bashar al-Assad's sovereignty. Why? Well, I'm of the opinion that the answer is that decolonization was seen to become wrong, to go wrong. And you can think about this in a couple of ways. The first way is more favorable. Decolonization takes the state, the nation state, sovereignty to the ends of the earth. And only once it goes to the ends of the earth do we realize that it's not enough. We need other tools. The state can go wrong. There's another possibility, which is that somehow we are skeptical that the people we once ruled through empires can rule themselves. And when we see them not able to run their countries very well, when they see them abusing their own citizens, we need to act. Now think about it. In 1776, there were lots of human rights violations. In fact, the winning side not only killed a lot of people, but expelled tens of thousands of so-called loyalists to elsewhere in the British Empire. But nobody said, we need a human rights regime, to my knowledge. After Hitler, almost no one said that. As I mentioned, the state emerged unscathed and was about to become global. After, let's say, Africans got the state, we begin to think we might need a human rights movement. And I wonder if that's because the limits of states emerged, or because we worry that certain kinds of people aren't up to the challenge of sovereignty. In any case, at this moment in the 1970s, people began to worry that decolonization was a great tragedy, that we needed to act. to curb its abuses, to do something about the violence of states finally. Here's what Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who's a very famous liberal in the United States, advisor to John F. Kennedy, later a professor, says in 1977. States may meet all the criteria of self-determination and be blots on the planet. Human rights will be the way of reaching a deeper principle, which is individual self-determination. So that's an attack on the anti-colonial phase of human rights, to overturn it in the name of what we seem to mean about human rights. Well, let me turn towards my conclusion. This was a massive change. It's changed our view about not just what human rights are, but what's at stake in politics. Many people in the 1940s and 50s would have gone to college with idealism about their own country, building a better state for their fellow citizens. Those are the people who went to college and then went on freedom rides in this part of the country and demanded that our citizenship change because it wasn't good enough. So that was civil rights, when the phrase human rights, was not very popular in this country, actually. Now a lot of people think that the highest kind of moral concern is to care about suffering abroad. In fact, most colleges in this country are even making human rights a topic of study for people who want to come, even major in human rights, because they think that what's at stake in the world now is not our citizenship, but suffering abroad. This seems like a substantial change, and I've tried to suggest that human rights are bound up in it. Now, it has a good side. It seems crucial to care about atrocity. It seems as if Holocaust memory has not only changed our view of the past of World War II, leading us to think that the Holocaust mattered, and it should matter if it risks recurring now. But there might have been some negative features in this transformation. Maybe there was something lost along the way and not just gained. You could put it in terms of the transformation of the way we feel solidarity. So there was very limited solidarity in the 1940s. It was chiefly with fellow citizens. But we committed to expensive solidarity. A welfare state is very costly. And people in the North Atlantic said, we're willing to commit to that cost, especially in Western Europe, but even in the United States. We have a different solidarity. It's more expansive. It's now not limited to our fellow citizens. It's global. Human rights get us to empathize with people not because they're fellow Americans, but because they're fellow humans. But this solidarity is also cheap. If we compare what a welfare state costs to what it costs to be charitable to our fellow man around the world, it's not as expensive. We seem less up to the challenge of using our pocketbook in the name of solidarity. So that's the story I wanted to tell. There are more details, but I think if we wanted to get very historical, we'd have to look at a couple of, let's say, boundary points. If we looked in the 1960s, we still don't find human rights being used to address suffering abroad, including when our own country is perpetrating it. If we look at the concept of genocide, it has a little different story. It's more used in the 1960s than human rights is to describe things abroad. There's something called the Biafra secession crisis. When a lot of people die, people claim genocide is taking place. There's something called the Russell Tribunal, when a bunch of intellectuals, led by Bertrand Russell, famous philosopher, gets together and say America is committing war crimes in Vietnam and there should be a new Nuremberg trial. And probably the most famous of these, named Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, even goes so far to say that America is committing genocide. But no one yet says these are human rights violations. Somehow that idea hasn't gotten attached to international tragedies. But then you look in the 1980s, just 15 years later, people begin to talk about what's happened in Cambodia in the prior decade, in secret, the killing fields. That was genocide too. But now, if you look at the sources, they talk about human rights all the time. And I think that's because they don't just care about international tragedy because of Holocaust memory, but this idea of human rights has gotten transformed in the process over those crucial decades. But the fact is we haven't figured this puzzle out. Most of my talk has been about this strange fact that we assume that human rights and the Holocaust got connected in the 40s when they didn't. And we haven't even begun to look in the 60s and 70s and 80s when they finally did get connected. So let me conclude with just that balance sheet, which I've already hinted. I'm not at all suggesting that Holocaust memory wasn't a good thing. I think it changed our moral sense. Some people think that Holocaust memory made us care too much about the Jews, maybe to support Israel too fervently. I don't think that's totally correct, because it seems as if Holocaust memory made us care about international atrocity in general, wherever it occurs. That's why Barack Obama appeals to the memory of the 1940s, to gas, when he tries to rouse us to care about Syrian children. And that has to be seen as a massive breakthrough, because we should care about our fellow man around the world. No doubt about that. But there may be some negative, some costs that came along the way. What are those costs? Well, I think the main cost has to do with the loss of a certain welfarist idea that used to be at the heart of the human rights concept and has since been lost. You might put this in a kind of, philosophical way, and I'm even going to use a couple of Latin phrases. Human rights in the beginning, in the 1940s, were about a summum bonum, the kind of citizenship we should all have, that we proclaim that every nation should establish. That's national welfarism. Now human rights seem to be about the reverse, a summum malum. We want to prevent evil in its worst outbreaks. We can also say that to whom human rights apply has shifted. In the 40s, they were about us, our citizenship. In the 90s and since, they're about them, their misrule, their tragedy, what we do to help them. And then we come back, I think, to the matter of money. The welfarist ideal was at its height after World War II. It hadn't yet been undermined by later doubts. And now in this country, it's next to dead. And the sad thing is not only that we've lost national welfarism in the age of international human rights and concerns bred by the Holocaust about atrocity abroad, no one talks about global welfarism. So the really radical thing, I think, would be to keep our eye on atrocity, retrieving the original meaning of human rights, but also broadening it, because it seems as if we should owe our fellow humans something that's not just cheap, but something that's expensive for us, since we're so much richer than them. We should ask not just about whether human rights require us to intervene to keep despots at bay, but to live better lives after the despot is gone. So I will stop there and hopefully take some questions that I may have inspired through these remarks.